Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the last session. Have you had a good event? I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's been successful and educational for you. My name is Dan Holme, and for those of you who've not met me yet, I'd like to welcome you to the final session of the day, Role-Based Management, an Extreme Makeover for Active Directory. I'll give you a quick introduction to myself, since many of you were in my previous session. I am a consultant and trainer and author by career. I've spent 17 years with the Microsoft technology stack, serving mostly Fortune 500 size organizations, generally very large companies. And during that time, I've seen organizations of every size fighting a very similar set of challenges, which is how do we make it easier for us to manage change in our environment, whether it's change in our users and their roles, changes in our computers, users logging on to different computers, and a lot of the solution to those kinds of pain points come out of role-based management. And so in this session, we're going to look at how you can implement role-based management with Active Directory, and you'll find that it solves what are probably some very common and serious pain points for us all, including if your boss comes up to you today and asks you, what can Dan get to? How do you answer that question right now? I mean, do you go and scan every permissions list in your environment and create a report? Or what if the question is, who has access to next year's budget? Tell me everyone who has access. How do you answer that? Those are among the kinds of questions that we will address in this, be able to address with the solutions we'll introduce in this session. Now, what I'm going to start with is a demonstration of the goal. So we're going to start with a look at what your world should be like. And I'm going to show you some tools that will demonstrate how effective role-based management can be. And then we will build all the steps to actually get there. So we're going to start by looking at the forest, and then we'll go look at the trees along the way. And I'm going to show you some tools that I will give you as well. I will make them available. In fact, on the slides, there is a URL to my SkyDrive. And so when you download the slides, you will be able to jump up to this location to get the tools. So they will be available for you as well. So let's jump up into our demo environment and take a look. So we're in our domain, which is creatively called contoso.com. And in this domain, we have a user, Penny. Now, this is a brand new user account. I've just created it. Let's take a quick look, and we'll see that Penny is right now a member of, whoops, I don't even want her in that. Let's take her out of that. Penny is, let me fix something here. Penny is a member of no groups whatsoever. She's just a member of domain users. She's going to start working for us tomorrow. And she also sits at a computer, and her computer is called where did her computer go here? Let me fix it. Her computer is called Desktop 432. So that is the computer she logs on to. And again, right now that computer is a member of no groups whatsoever. It is just a member of domain computers. So we've got a brand new user and a brand new computer. I have a tool that I've built right here that simply shows us those group memberships. So it shows us that she's a user who is a member of domain computers, domain users, and she has no access to anything right now. She has no access to resources. She's not on any email distribution lists. She has no applications that are being pushed to her computer. She has no group policies applied to her, no logon scripts, nothing. Brand new user. Now, what role-based management is going to allow us to do is to define a user and a computer and then have all of these things deployed automatically. So just as an example, we've just created these accounts for Penny and for her computer. Let's go ahead and define Penny as an accountant in Antwerp. So we're going to go ahead and make her a member of our accountants group. And we'll also make her computer a member of the Antwerp group. So I've got a group of accounts and a group of locations, including Antwerp. Let me just make sure I did that all correctly. So we've just made her, we've added her to accounting, and we've added her computer to a single group. Now, so all I've done is change 2 group memberships. I've defined the user as one role. I've defined the computer by one role, which is the fact that it is that it is here in Antwerp. And now when I refresh this page, we can see immediately that that user has access to resources she needs as an accountant. She has access to the accounting share. She has edit permissions. She has read permissions to the budget share. Her computer gets Microsoft Office and the accounting suite. And because she's also an employee now, she automatically has read access to the company share, and all computers get Microsoft Office. So all of these things just happened by defining one computer role and one user role. Now, roles are nested within each other. So if we were to go look at our roles, like the accounting role, we would see that the accounting role is a member of accounts payable, accounts receivable, and finance. And the finance role is a member of employees. So these roles are nested within each other. So by changing by adding the user to one group and adding the computer to a group, we have nested and created additional changes in our environment. Now, let's say that Penny does such a good job as an accountant that she gets promoted to finance manager. And the finance management takes place in Sydney, Australia. So we have added her to the group of to the finance managers group, and we've taken her computer out of Antwerp and moved it into Sydney by changing its group membership as well. So again, I've just changed 2 group memberships. I'm just using a tool to do it, so you don't have to wait for me to click. So we've changed 2 group memberships. When we refresh the user's description, we see that Penny is now in Sydney. We see that she is a member of finance and finance managers. Finance managers are a member of managers. And so now she has more access than she had before. Now she has edit access to the budget as well as read. She has edit access to the accounting share still. She still gets Microsoft Office, but now because she's a manager, she gets Budget Pro, a special piece of software pushed to her. She's also a member of new lists. Where she was just on the accounting distribution list, she's now also on the management distribution list. And where before we were redirecting her folders to a data center in Antwerp, now we're redirecting her folders to a data center in Sydney that's more appropriate. And we have logon scripts that are running that are quite different. Now she's getting manager's logon scripts. So all of the 2 changes we made to her group memberships have cascaded into all kinds of other changes in the environment. We'll go one more step. We'll promote her to Chief Financial Officer, which means we've made her an executive, and all of our executives are in New York, so we have added her computer to the New York group and taken it out of Sydney. We'll refresh one more time, and we'll see that now that she is an executive, she has yet more resource access. She now has edit access to the board meetings share. She is now on the executive's email list, and she gets a piece of software called Perks Plus. In addition, she's now living in New York, so her folders are being redirected to New York, and logon scripts are appropriate for her as a manager. So all of this is really meant to demonstrate what role-based management is about. And role-based management is about categorizing a user and having that categorization impact everything about how that user is managed. Their access to resources, their logon rights, their system privileges, the software they get, policies, configuration, email distribution lists, everything comes out of the definition of that user and of the computer. Now, a lot of us focus on users when we look at role-based management, but it's equally important for computers as well. So all of this boils down to basically asking who can do what where. What user can do what, can have access to resources, can get certain software, and where. And it boils down to managing groups effectively in Active Directory by having what are called role groups and resource access groups. So we're going to go into the details of all of this. But before we do, let's focus on what some of the assumptions are of role-based management. Role-based management assumes that organizational roles drive requirements. It's not the fact that the user says, I need this, that matters. What matters is the organization says the user needs X. If the user is an accountant, they need certain software. If the user is a manager, they need access to certain resources. So the organizational roles drive the requirements. And roles are more persistent than assets. What that means is, it's not the fact that Penny needs access to this resource today. It's the fact that because Penny is a manager, she needs access to the resource. And when she leaves the company and someone else is the manager, that manager will need the same access. It's the roles that are persistent, and they last a lot longer than the human beings or the devices. Humans change jobs, humans get hired and fired, computers come and go, but the roles of our organizations tend to be very static and tend to evolve much more slowly. And this is very important not just in large organizations where there are very distinct definitions of roles, but even in small organizations. In small organizations, what you find is that there's one person who wears a lot of hats. They do a lot of jobs. So one person is both the human resources manager and the operations manager and the accountant. And that's true because it's a small organization, and they have 3 roles. But then as the organization grows, those roles get split up. One person gets hired to be just the human resources manager. One person gets hired just to be the operations manager. And that original user ends up being just the CFO. And so those roles get split up across multiple users, or vice versa. The organization contracts. So all of these things are underpinning our assumptions of what is important in an organization. And the payoff of all of this is that you're going to have a much more dynamic and agile environment. You can define users and computers, and everything else just happens. That makes it easier to maintain compliance and security. It makes it easier to answer questions, as we'll see. And so there's huge payoff in role-based management. Now, as we head into, as we get ready to start discussing this, you might start having some questions already, and those questions might include these. You might be asking, okay, this sounds great, but how do you do it? We will talk about that. You might be thinking, well, my enterprise is more complicated than what Dan is showing us. So this example I've been showing you is very simple. Yes, and that's just so we can understand it. But what's underpinning this is very scalable. I've seen it done in extremely large organizations. Another question you might be asking is, okay, this is if this is going to involve groups, it sounds like I might need a lot of groups. And the answer to that question is yes, you will, and we'll discuss the impact of that later, but it ends up being a very good thing. And last but not least, how many roles should a user belong to? In most organizations, you can define a user with a small handful of roles. Dan is a consultant and author and trainer at AvePoint. He lives in Hawaii, and his computer is a laptop that does this with this. So after about maybe 8 or 10 roles, I pretty much defined who I am. Now, those roles might be nested into other roles that say that because I am performing a job, that makes me an employee. So roles can be nested, but the actual unique definition of the user ends up being just a couple of roles. So that's sort of the overview. That's the sort of the goal. That's where we're heading with this. Are there any questions at this point about just the concepts and what you've seen so far? Okay. So to set this up, we take a big step back, and this is really going to be about a very effective and careful and efficient management of groups in Windows. And so I'd like to step us through this, and this should be familiar to you. This should be fairly obvious. If you have a resource, like the sales folder, and you want to assign permissions to it, you can assign permissions to each individual identity, each user in your environment. You can do that. You're allowed to. But we all know that's a bad idea. It's not manageable. So in this case, what I'd like to point out are some terms. We've got our resource on our right. We've got the identities on the left. And we are managing access in the access control list itself. That's where we have to go to actually say this user has a certain permission to this resource. And if we manage in the access control list, that means it's very difficult to report what has happened. We have to go to every single folder and look at that access control list to do reporting. And if we need to make a change on multiple resources, we need to go into the access control list because that's where we are performing the management. So we all know that you should assign permissions to groups, right? We've all learned that. So you have a resource, you have identities, but now you are grouping those identities together and assigning a permission once. You are no longer managing access in the access control list. You're managing access in the group. If someone needs access, you put them in. If someone doesn't need access, you pull them out. So you've centralized group management, and if you want to know who has access to that resource, you can simply go and look at the membership of the group, right? So we've all learned that it's easier to manage access by putting users into a group. Now the problem is, and one other benefit of groups is they add scalability. You might have multiple resources that group needs access to. So they need access to a shared folder, they need access to some news, to some reports. There's multiple things on multiple servers, and each of those resources can have a permission granting access to that one group. And so now when you add a user to the group, they have access to multiple resources. So groups add scalability as well, which should be fairly obvious. Now the problem is that one type of group isn't enough. If all we have are groups that say you are sales, you are finance, you are consulting, we start running into problems because most often in an organization, multiple groups need access to a resource. So let's just say that for our sales folder, we want sales to have access, but we also need marketing to have access. And we also need our executives to have access. Oh, and that's right, we hired a consultant. That one user needs access as well. They're not part of any of our groups, but they need access too. We are now having to assign multiple permissions in the access control list to multiple groups as well as users. We are back to managing access in the access control list. So once again, if we want to report something, we have to start by looking at the access control list. We've taken our management back to that level, and that's not a good thing. And that's because we only have one type of group. So what we need is an additional type of group called a rule group. And the rule group manages the access to this particular resource. So in this case, the rule group is an access management rule, where now we have one group that defines read permission to these resources. It can be assigned to as many resources as we need, one or more resources. We put all of our identities, users and role groups, into the rule group, and now we are back to managing access in a group. We can do it in central Active Directory. We can do it one place, one time, add a user to that group, and that one user now has access to all of the resources. So you have to have two types of groups in Active Directory. You have to have role groups that define who a user is, and you have to have rule groups that define what can be done and what it is you are trying to manage. Now, up to this point, you'll notice I haven't talked about domain, local, and global groups because it really often doesn't matter. Those are technical things. What we're really implementing is a business process on top of a technology. But let's cut to the chase here. Often you will implement this type of resource access management by having your role groups be global groups, global security groups, and your rule groups be domain local security groups. But that is true for this type of access. For other types of management, you will use all global groups. So it really depends. So it doesn't really matter what type of Windows group you're using. What matters is how the group is being used. It is a role group that defines users. It is a rule group that manages something. And then you nest your role groups into your rule groups based on your business logic, and you now have role-based management in place. So that's sort of the big picture, and let's take a quick look at it in our environment, and then we'll go into even more detail. So in our environment, we have our role groups, like accounting, and we have rule groups that manage things. So for example, I have several groups that manage stuff, like we have a group that manages edit permission to the budget. Then we simply, and I'm just going to save some clicking by doing this with a script. So we can have a folder for our budget. Let me make sure this did this correctly. Yeah. So when we look at the permissions list, we have a very short list of permissions for, let me sort this by name so it's easier to see. for who has read permission. If you're in this group, you have read permission. And this becomes the rule group defining who has read permission. So if I want to give, let's say, executives read permission, I can add them to that rule group, and we've done our nesting and achieved that. So that's the overview, sort of at the next level of technology. Now we're going to go into each individual type of group and talk about the nuances of creating and managing these groups. Questions at this point? Okay. So first let's look at our role groups. Role groups are groups like accounting, executives, and role groups are generally fairly easy to define in an organization. They define users and computers based on business criteria, and examples might be your job, your business unit, your department, your team, your location, your seniority. These types of groups are pretty easy to define in an organization. You'll have lots of ways of identifying those. Now, one of the key points about role groups is that they should be highly trusted, because a resource owner is going to add one of these role groups to their rule group. And what I mean by that is, if I'm responsible for managing who has edit permission to the budget, I will be managing this group, and I will add the sales group. I will add a role. It's important that that role is trusted, because I don't have access to that. I don't know that who is in sales really is a salesperson. So we want to make sure that these role groups are trusted, and that not anyone can add users to them. These should be coming from highly trusted sources, and preferably from authoritative sources. Meaning you might have a tool that looks at PeopleSoft and knows who your salespeople are and populates the group with those salespeople. So hopefully these role groups can be highly trusted by the owners of the resources. Generally speaking, role groups will be global security groups. Now, there's some small exceptions in fine print there, but almost all the time, these will be global security groups. And in these groups will be users, other groups, where your employees group includes your accountants, for example, and computers. So computers will be members of roles as well. And some, typically, a group will either have users or computers, but some roles might have both. So for example, I've got a role group that defines laptops in my organization, that defines virtual clients, that defines Windows 7 versus Windows XP clients. Those are role groups that I can then use to manage my environment, and those contain only computers. My employee roles, or my user roles, are things like accounting, executive, finance, sales, etc. Those are just users. But sometimes you'll have groups that really should have both users and computers. For example, my Antwerp group will have both users and computers in it. So I've got some users, and somewhere in here, it's not. Oh, that's because she got promoted to New York. We'll add desktop 432 to indicate that this computer is in Antwerp as well. And by having groups that contain both users and computers, you can do things like scope group policies that might contain some user settings and some computer settings, so that when a user logs on to a computer in Antwerp, they have a little bit of a different experience than if they log on to a computer in New York City. Some groups will have both users and computers in them. You should ideally organize these in Active Directory in a way that makes sense. So I like to have OUs for my different types of role groups. There's an example on the slide for you to look at. And you want to come up with a good naming convention. Naming conventions are very important with role-based management. And in the case of role groups, there's three prefixes that I like to use when defining roles. One is LOC_, which would represent a location group. One is COMP_, which represents computer groups that we looked at. And then I also like having ADM_, which represents my administrative roles. Let me see if I can find those here. Where did they go? Like ADM_ help desk is the role of my help desk. But I like to have ADM because it helps me highlight groups that have administrative functionality within my organization. So I like to have prefixes for certain types of groups, but standard user roles like accounting, sales, executives, finance, those kinds of roles I prefer not to have a prefix on, because these are the groups that tend to be most visible to other users when they're when they're looking at Active Directory and doing things in our environment. Human being roles are very visible to normal users, so I prefer not to have a prefix for those. As a quick summary of the role groups are the real critical part of role-based management. They define who a user is. It should be highly trusted, preferably authoritative. You want to make sure that they're tightly delegated in Active Directory because they need to be trusted and authoritative. They're typically global security groups containing users, computers, and other roles, and you should have a very strict naming convention for your role groups. So before we move on to rule groups, any questions on role groups? Okay, so rule groups are next. Our rule groups manage things. Now, I'm going to focus on managing security because it's very understandable and it's also something many of us need to do. So we will focus on rule groups for resource access management, but there's other scenarios as well. And role groups have a variety of terminology associated with them. Sorry, rule groups. Rule groups are sometimes called management groups. They're sometimes called capability management or task groups. I prefer to use the word rule group, and of course, there'll be yet additional terms in your language, whatever that might be. And your rule groups are very, very, very critical and important that you have a naming convention for them. So, for example, when dealing with resource access, I like to, when I'm with a client, create a naming convention that starts with ACL underscore, then has the name of the resource, then an underscore, and then permission, and then the permission associated with that group. So for example, every resource access group starts with ACL underscore. It then has the name of the resource we're talking about, maybe sales folders, and then has the permission level. So there might be sales folders read, sales folders edit, sales folders full, whatever the case might be. And when you look at a naming convention, what you see and what is very, very important is the concept of a delimiter. A delimiter separates the different parts of the name. And I like to use underscores as the delimiter. Now, a delimiter creates an expression, a pattern that can be used later. So we use the underscore as a delimiter. We do not use the underscore anywhere else. So notice, for example, sales folders has a space there. It doesn't use an underscore because the underscore is a delimiter. So we reserve it for use there. And by having this kind of discipline, it gives you the ability to write scripts and code that is able to dissect your group names. And we'll see how that comes back to be important for us in just a little bit. It also allows you to present the names more effectively. So if every permissions group has ACL underscore, it makes it easy for me to find the right kind of group to assign permissions to. Let me show you what I mean by that. When it comes time to give edit permission to the budget, actually let's do our, new folder. Whoops, it's already there. Actually, I'm going to delete this folder and we'll recreate it. I've just created this budget folder, and when it comes time to assign permissions to it, I'm going to have lots and lots of groups in Active Directory. When I go to add the group, I can start by typing ACL underscore, and when I do that, what I get is only groups in Active Directory that should have permissions associated with them. So I've got a naming convention that allows me to quickly find the specific types of groups that I need to assign permissions to. I don't accidentally give a permission to sales or to executives because I know I've got a naming convention that focuses me on that specific type of group. So having a naming convention helps you with the presentation of group names within your environment as well. So the prefix defines the purpose of the group. I like to use ACL for resource access. It facilitates discoverability and use of groups, as I've just shown you. And the prefixes that I personally like to use are ACL underscore, SYS, and SYS is used for system permissions. So let me show you some examples of that. Excuse me. So if we look here, we see, let's take New York. We see SYS underscore NYC clients underscore admins. SYS is a prefix that I like to use to indicate that this group is managing system permissions rather than access control lists. We see a delimiter that breaks that into 3 sections. And this tells me that this particular group is a member of administrators on New York City clients. And so I have a group policy that drops this group into the administrators group on all New York City clients, and my naming convention helps me spot that in Active Directory. So we've got New York, we've got San Francisco, we've got Vancouver, we've got Sydney using SYS underscore. Another prefix I like to use is APP underscore. APP underscore defines who gets an application. So you might remember that when Penny became an executive, she got a piece of software called Perks Plus. The way that worked is because I've got a group called app underscore Perks Plus, and Penny, whoops, something went wrong here. I must have changed something. Let me fix it. Hopefully this will fix it. There we go. Executives get this particular piece of software. So APP underscore indicates a group that decides who gets an application. This is just the group in Active Directory. Obviously, I need to have a tool that uses this group. So I might have group policy or System Center Configuration Manager or some third-party application deployment tool that pushes the application based on the membership of this group. And so APP underscore is for application management rather than, say, security management. And finally, a small example is UPD underscore, which I use to indicate who gets updates and who doesn't. In most cases, in your enterprise, you want most clients and servers to get updates pretty much as soon as they're available, but you also will want to have some clients and servers getting updates as a part of your pilot and test. And you might have other clients and servers who shouldn't be updated for one reason or another because it might break some software. So UPD underscore manages update deployment, and then my Windows Server Update Services, my WSUS, uses those groups to decide who gets updates. GPO underscore, used for group policy filtering, and CCM underscore for a group that is used by multiple change management tools to achieve an effect. So those slides can be used as a reference for you for different types of prefixes that you might choose to use in your organization. Now, these role groups will often be implemented as domain local security groups, especially for security management, unless what you are doing involves group policy. Group policy, as you probably know, can only be filtered with global groups. So if it is a group that is being used by group policy, it needs to be a global group. So, for example, my application deployment groups that we were just looking at, like Perks Plus, this is a global group because I'm using group policy to push the software out to the users. Group policy can only scope to global groups. And in the rule groups, in these rule groups, you will generally have roles. So if we're talking about who can edit the budget, it might be executives and finance. We're putting roles into these rule groups. But there will be times when you also have individual users or computers in a role group, and that's perfectly okay. Let me go back to a slide that I had earlier to show you an example of that. So this is an example here where we have a group that's managing access to a folder. That is a rule group. The rule group will have roles in it. That's the most common. But every once in a while, there's going to be an exception to the rule where an individual user or a computer needs access, even though that user is not a member of one of those groups. That's totally fine. But what you want to watch out for is if you end up with a rule group that has a lot of individual users, that should be an alarm for you. And you should look at all those users and say, do they have something in common that maybe I should create a new role group and put those users into? So you can use the number of individual exceptions as a way of figuring out whether maybe you need another role defined in your environment as well. Again, you should have these rules in Active Directory organized and delegated in a way that makes sense to you. And one nice thing about these rule groups is you can delegate them to the business owners of the resource. So for example, let's say that I want Penny, who is now our CFO, I want her to decide who can read the budget. I can take that group and I can delegate that to Penny. Now, there are several ways to delegate in Active Directory, but one of the more interesting ways in this context is the Managed By tab. The Managed By tab can point to a user, and I can specify that the manager can update the membership list. When I do that, it sets a permission on the group that allows that user to change the member's attribute, and that user can now go in and add and remove users to the group. Now, again, there's other ways of delegating, and I usually like to delegate at the OU level. That's obviously more manageable. But when it comes down to the individual groups, you often will have one user who's responsible for a small handful of groups, and another user is responsible for another handful of groups. And so you can delegate individual groups to a user or to another group, and they can then manage access. Let me check something real quick here. Yeah. Now, let's say that we have delegated that group to Penny, and we now are letting her manage the membership of that group. How do we let her manage membership of the group? What tool do we give her? Do we want to give our users Active Directory users and computers? Nah, not so much. There is a little tip that, if you don't know, is kind of cool, and that is if you go to Network in Windows Vista or later, and then you click Search Active Directory, you can search for a group that you're responsible for. So, for example, if I'm Penny, I can look for that budget edit group. And when I open it up, I get the dialog box that lets me add and remove members. This does not require Active Directory users and computers. And as you can see, the interface is much easier than Active Directory users and computers. All the other tabs are hidden. So this is a really cool little trick to give to your business users who do own groups so that they can manage membership without needing any sort of crazy tool. All right, so to summarize rule groups, these are generally going to be domain local groups. They should be organized and delegated in Active Directory in a way that makes sense. And these groups will contain roles and individual users and computers. And very, 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 very important, you have a good naming convention. And we'll see the benefit of that in a moment. We've seen one benefit so far, which is just that you can find the groups more easily. Questions so far on rule groups? Yes? Yeah, great question. So the question is, what is the impact of having a user belong to a lot of groups? And that's a perfect question, and you might remember one of the earlier slides was, aren't there going to be a lot of groups? And the answer is yes. The straight performance impact is negligible. That's not a problem. What can be a problem is if a user belongs to too many groups, things can start to break. And we'll talk about that in just a few moments later in the presentation. But assuming things don't break completely, performance-wise, it's not a problem. So hold on and we'll talk about the rest.
How do you solve the issue when, for deployment of applications, that an application is deployed to a computer?
Excellent question. So his question is basically calling my bluff. I played a little trick and he realized it, which is when you deploy an application like Perks Plus, it really should not go to a user. It should go to a computer. Most applications are not licensed per user, they're licensed per computer. And if a user sits down at 5 different computers and gets this application installed on all 5 because it follows the user, that's usually a bad thing. So typically, applications need to be deployed to a computer. It's the computer or a computer role that would be nested into this group. So his question is, how do you then manage that? And that really is an issue of business process and tools and scripts. So you need to have something that when Penny requests a particular piece of software, it is not her account that goes into the software group, but rather her computer. There needs to be a pairing of the two. And in the resource kit that I wrote for Microsoft, there is a really interesting solution that I'll tell you about. So this is a small digression, and this is in the resource kit. There's a schema extension that I've included in the resource kit that creates an additional set of attributes. So when you look at a computer object, you can assign the computer object to a user, and it can be assigned to more than one user. So it's a multi-valued attribute that's part of the computer object that points to user accounts, very much like a group member attribute points to user accounts. Then the schema extension also adds attributes to the user, so you can see what computers have been assigned to the user. And that is a linked attribute. So when you assign a computer to a user, you also can go to the user and see the computer. So I've done it with a schema extension, which then scripts can use to say when Penny requests this piece of software, what computers is she on? Okay, let's go add those computers to the group. But you do have to find a solution. There's nothing built into Windows to do that for you, which is really kind of strange. It's one of, I think, the biggest pain points with Active Directory is no way to immediately associate a user and their computer. Yeah, so there's no real answer, but does that answer your question? Okay. Other questions? Yeah.
You say that you use global groups and local groups?
Yes.
But would it be a wrong thing, or would it be a negative thing to do to use universal groups and make them mail-enabled so that you can actually then send emails to a specific role of people or to a specific application or something?
Yeah.
People that all have FileZilla, for instance, and you want to email the FileZilla server will be unavailable or something like that.
Yeah, so his question is, as far as building these groups, would it be wrong to use universal groups for mail enabling? But first of all, you can mail enable other types of groups, I believe, right? You don't have to use universal groups to email enable them. Exchange doesn't like it. Okay, I'm not as much of an Exchange person. The real answer is it really depends on your business requirements. I prefer to do email as a separate management function. So we haven't been talking about that, but if we look in my Active Directory here, I have a set of email groups that are distribution lists, and these might very well be either have users nested in them or be universal groups, and we manage this separately. So when a user gets a piece of software, they may also go into a group that is email enabled. But it really depends on all of your business requirements. So there's no easy answer for that one. Any other questions? All right. So moving on here. Let me make sure I keep track of the time. Okay. So we have the role groups, we have the rule groups. The rest is the business logic. That is what is appropriate for your business for nesting the groups. So this is all about you nesting the roles into the rules. That we don't have really many slides on because it's specific to your business. So let's just take a look at an example. We have a nesting rule that says accountants are members of this particular email list. They're members of this particular permissions group. They get this piece of software. So this is our business logic implemented simply as nesting. So that will be specific to you. Now let's start looking at the outcomes, the benefits of all of this, and then we'll look at some of the problems that you have to work around. So outcome-wise, we now have visibility and auditing capabilities that we haven't had before. If our boss comes to us and says, who is able to do X, we now can answer that question. So for example, if the boss comes in and says, who can edit the budget? We can answer that question. Let's see how. If the boss asks, who can edit the budget? We simply open up the ACL budget edit group, and we look at who are the members. Now, of course, the members may include other groups, so we then have to open up that group, go to its membership, keep expanding, and if you're paid by the hour, this is a really good way to do it. Otherwise, the bottom line is Active Directory is terrible at enumerating group memberships, which is, again, really kind of strange after 10 years. You'd think there would be a built-in tool to do that. There's not. So what you can do is turn to the command line. At the command line, you can use the ds-get-group command to enumerate the members, and if you use the expand switch, you can see all the nested members. So if we go into Active Directory, or sorry, into the command prompt, and type ds-get-group, and then the name of our group, which is ACL budget edit, and then it's in our access OU, in our groups OU, in our contoso.com domain. We ask for the members. That gives us our direct members. If we add the expand switch, it gives us all of the members. So ds-get can enumerate the members, and there's a really nice little PowerShell commandlet that's listed here that can get our membership as well. So from a PowerShell command prompt, we can type get AD group member. That's the commandlet name. We have the distinguished name of our group with the switch recursive. And that gets every single nested member of the group. It's going to give us more information than we need. It gives us the user's name and GUID and all kinds of crazy information. So we simply select just their username, and it gives us a nice list of users. So Windows PowerShell gives it to us. You can also use a tool that I will give you called the Members Report tool. And let's take a look at that. Hopefully I have that on this machine. Let's see. Members. Yeah, Members Report. And I will give you this tool. This will work in your environment, plug and play. Open up the tool, put in a group name, and what this does is it enumerates all the nested members and then displays them based on whether they are direct members, indirect members, users, or groups. So you get a nice list of who has access and why. This is the Members Report tool, and I'll give that to you. So and all this is a Visual Basic script that organizes the users based on whether they're direct or indirect and what type of object they are. You can have a web application that goes in and reports. So that you can go to a website and say who's in this group, and you have a script that does the same thing. So there are several different ways to provide that visibility, and the bottom line is all of these are simply enumerating the group membership. It's a much easier way to answer this question than if you didn't have role-based management. If you didn't have role-based management, you would have to go to every single folder that was involved, look at the access control list, and then go to every single group on the access control list and start enumerating the membership. It would get really, really crazy to do without role-based management. And similarly, if our boss asks, what can Penny do? It's just the reverse question. We look at what groups Penny is a member of. So we can go into Active Directory. We can start with Penny. And we go to her Member Of tab. Again, we would have to expand each of these. This would get very old very, very quick. And so we can use the ds-get command, except we use ds-get user. I'm not going to type it because it'll take too long. We use ds-get user or computer, if it's a computer, the distinguished name of the user, the member of switch, and expand, and that will expand that group's memberships, or that user's memberships. And I will also give you the member of report script, which again is a plug-and-play script, member of report. You put in a username, and it will tell you that user's primary group memberships, direct memberships, and indirect memberships. And so this tells us what Penny can do. Now notice in here you can see all of the very disciplined names. I've got ACL underscore, app underscore, GPO underscore, LST underscore, SCR underscore, and anything that doesn't have a prefix is a role group. So I have a very disciplined naming convention where every type of group has a prefix except for normal human groups. And those don't have a prefix, which itself is a kind of rule. If it doesn't have this, it has to be that. So I've got a very disciplined naming convention, which is what gave me the ability to create this tool that we started with at the beginning of class. Remember I showed you that I can look at Penny and it tells me exactly what location she's in, what roles she's in, what resources she has access to. This tool is exactly the same as this one, except it takes that group name and based on the prefix puts it into a different category. It just sorts it differently. And based on the prefix, for example, ACL underscore budget underscore edit. So the ACL prefix causes that group to be displayed here. And instead of displaying the group name, the script goes to Active Directory and pulls out the group's description. So the description field is being shown instead of just the group name. So because I have a lot of discipline in how I name the groups and what I put in Active Directory, I can create a tool that reports it very, very cleanly. So there's nothing magical about this tool other than the fact that it's leveraging my discipline, my conventions on the back end. So you can start seeing some of the huge benefits of being very, very, very disciplined in your role-based management. Okay. Before I talk about the problems that you have to worry about, any questions now that we've sort of seen all the good stuff? Okay. There are a couple of things you have to think about and problems you need to plan for. One of which is, how do you ensure and audit the integrity of your role-based management system? So what I mean by that is all of this, when we ask the question, who can edit the budget, which we did, let's see, which tool was it? I've already closed it. When we asked who could edit the budget, it depended on the fact that this group is the only group that has permission to edit the budget. It means that someone didn't go to the access control list and just start adding other things. So we have to make sure that that access control list has been locked down and that only this group has that permission and someone hasn't worked around the system. There are several ways to do that. One is to go and scan your access control lists. So we go with a script or manually, we look at the access control list, and if our environment is pure, we should see nothing on that access control list that doesn't start with ACL underscore. So if we go back to our server, we look at the access control list on the budget. Oh, it looks like, yeah, I forgot I reset it. So this is bad. What we should see is that only groups that start with ACL should be on this list, except for things like system and administrators. Anything that is not ACL underscore means someone has worked around our system and our report won't be good anymore. Does that make sense? So we could scan the access control lists to make sure that we see only ACL underscores on that access control list. That would be one way to ensure integrity, but that means we find out after the fact. The second way would be to create what are called event syncs, where we monitor for changes in permissions and we make sure that people aren't adding groups that are incorrect. Or we can start auditing the use of the change permissions permission. So if we set up our permissions and then we audit who's changing permissions, that will help us also ensure the integrity of the system. And last but not least, the ultimate solution to this is to use what's called a proxy. And in a proxy scenario, you have a tool like a web application that sets security on the folders. So when I create the budget folder, the tool does it for me. It goes and creates the folder, it enforces my business logic, it sets permissions to the correct groups, and I as an administrator cannot go directly to the folder and set permissions. I don't have rights to change permissions on my server. I have to use the tool in the middle. And by doing that, I make a request of my tool. My tool runs with credentials that can do it. That means I don't have even permission to work around the system. And that's where you really want to get. And I've built a couple of these for customers where we have a web application that when they need to provision a folder, they type in the name, they click go, it creates the creates the folder, it creates the groups in Active Directory for read and full control and edit, for example. It assigns those groups permissions, and it does it all, in an instant, and the administrator doesn't have to do a thing. And then the environment is manageable from that point forward. So you do have to think about how you audit and maintain your access control lists, and that is something to think about. The second thing to think about, starting to answer a question that was earlier, is aren't there going to be a lot of groups? And the answer is yes, there will be a lot of groups. And if you think about it, what you'll end up with is a group for each resource for each level of access. Why can't I get out of this? This is weird. Got a lot of things open here. Huh. That dialog box seems to be dead. Well, we'll just let it be dead. I was going to show you this. You'll end up basically with a group per resource per permission. So a budget edit, budget read, budget full. Now keep in mind that this group may be assigned permissions to several folders on several different servers, but you'll have a lot of groups because of this, for sure, no doubt about it. But that said, what's the alternative and what's the real problem? The alternative is you do it the way we've been doing it for 15 years, which is you don't create all the groups you need and you go to the access control list and start adding permissions. And when the boss comes and says who has access to that resource, you have to open up every single properties dialog box of every folder in your environment and start reporting the actual permissions. And that is extremely painful. Most of us are accustomed to that pain. We got used to it, and so we don't feel it so much anymore. But if you think about it, it's really kind of crazy, unless you're paid by the hour. So the alternative is you either have a lot of groups or you have a lot of permissions. And it's easier to maintain groups because they're in one place, they're in Active Directory. So the alternative is even worse. This is what you end up with in the alternative, and someone says who has access and what kind of access do they have. Very hard to figure that out. So by going into groups, we have a significant reduction in the number of points of management. We only have groups in Active Directory to worry about, and that's a lot easier. So that's the one concept. The other is what is the technical problems with having a lot of groups. First of all, the tools in Active Directory are really kind of cruddy. There isn't a tool that does nested group enumeration. You have to create it yourself. You have to use PowerShell. Tools aren't easily accessible to non-administrative users. So that is something you have to work around, is figuring out the user interface of all of this. The other issue you have to worry about, which heads towards your question, is what's called token size and token size bloat. So as you probably know, when you log on to the domain, you get a token, or let's say you log on to the domain and then your client builds a token that contains your user account and all of the groups that you're in. And that token then represents you. And then when you go touch a server, a file server, that file server builds another token for you that represents your user account and all of the groups. Each machine does it separately because you might be in local groups in that machine that would result in a different token. So every machine has a token for you, and that token contains your user and group memberships. Now, that token has a limited size. And there are several things that go into the calculation here. But the bottom line is at the bottom of this slide here, which is by default, as soon as you're in somewhere in the sort of 300 group range, you're going to start filling up the token, and it will start breaking. So I'm not going to go into all the math, but that's the issue. Now, when the token breaks, really weird errors happen. You would think that when you logged on, if it couldn't build a token for you, it would just prevent you from logging on. But that doesn't happen, unfortunately. It's really weird. But you will get weird errors like that will come from Windows, that will come from your applications, that will come from your web applications, and the error messages are completely weird. They'll tell you your password is incorrect. They'll tell you it's out of memory. They'll give you strange errors that are really tough to figure out. And they all come from the fact that your token is too big. So to change this, you need to modify what's called the max token size registry entry. And that entry is by default, again, allows you in about 200, 300 groups. You can expand that token size entry to hex FFFF, which gives you approximately 1,600 domain local or 8,000 global and universal group memberships. Now, because you're going to be in some global groups and some domain local groups, you're basically looking at a couple thousand groups at that point. that are possible by expanding the max token size. Now, the max token size registry entry needs to be deployed to every single machine in your forest, because a user logs on to their machine, but then they go touch a file server, and they touch another server. And so every server needs to be able to build the token that accounts for the maximum number of groups. So you set the max token size, you deploy it to every server in your environment. Now, what I don't recommend doing is just setting it to the maximum tomorrow morning when you go back to work. Instead, be aware of the potential problems, set the token size to a value that you believe is enough, and the math is on the previous slide. And then if you start thinking that you're going to run into problems, expand it a little bit more. But I don't think it's particularly helpful to just expand it all the way immediately in your environment. The other things you need to think about are if you have migrated to Active Directory from another domain using the Active Directory migration tool. Because if you've done that, your user account contains the SID history of your old user account from the old domain. And your groups contain the SID histories of your old groups. And each of those will bloat up the token as well. So if you've migrated from another domain, you should clean up your SID history attribute. There's a lot of reasons why you should do that, but token bloat is one of them. And the other major thing to note, and I'm going to add this to the slide here, in fact, because I've been meaning it to add it. Let me put it on this previous slide, is you have a hard Kerberos limit of 1,024 groups. So if you are using Kerberos authentication, the privilege access certificate, which is part of your token, your ticket in Kerberos, has a hard wired limit of 1,024 groups. So you cannot really effectively be a member of more than 1,000 groups. Now, to tell you the truth, I've never run into an enterprise where we had more than 1,000 groups for a single user. I have run into a situation where we were testing Active Directory delegation. And so we had done role-based management on Active Directory for the IT team. And this was a very distributed company where there were lots of different business units and lots of tasks. And we had done all this role-based management. It was beautiful, and it made it so easy to manage. But the user at the very top, the domain admin, was nested into so many groups that he was a member of about 700 or 800 groups, and his token bloated, and we ran out of space. But other than that, I have, and we expanded max token size, and it fixed it. But I've never run into 1,000 groups. That just hasn't really been necessary. So there's some information in knowledge base articles that are listed here on the slide. You do have to be aware of the max token size, but it's not necessarily something you have to panic about. There are a couple of other options for you, and this one is my favorite, which is use only global groups. Global groups take about 1/5 the size of space in your token as a domain local or a universal group. And so by using only global groups, you can have a lot more groups in your token. You can get to 1,000 groups, 1,024 groups, and still keep your token very, very small. Now, we all have learned that you're supposed to put users into global groups, into domain local groups, but the reality is the group scope doesn't matter and if you have a single domain. Because because the only time you really need your domain local groups is if you're bringing groups in from a Windows trusted domain. So you can get by with doing everything with global groups. I've done that with some clients. They're all of us are moving towards federation rather than trusts anyway. Trusts are so 1990s. Federation is sort of today. So you can definitely do this. Just don't tell Microsoft I told you you could do this. But it does work very well. If you start ending up in a lot of groups, and this usually happens for us as administrators, we're way high up in the chain, we're nested into a lot of groups. If you end up in a lot of groups, the alternative is, instead of nesting the high groups into the medium and lower groups, take the high groups to the side and set up a second rule. And the idea here is, you instead of nesting yourself into the group that has access to the sales folders, put yourself in a group that has access to all folders. And on the sales folder, you'll have 2 read permissions. One read permission to the sales folders read group, one read permission to the all folders read group. And you as a high-level user are in the all folders read group, which is one group that has read to a lot of places. That's what I call double ruling, or setting a policy that ends up with several permissions. There's one other thing I wanted to mention here. Let me think about it real quick. about token size. We talked about the 1024, double ruling. Oh, permissions. Here's one big benefit of role-based management that we haven't talked about yet. You have a folder in your environment. Oh, I keep forgetting this dialog box is stuck. You have a folder in your environment, and let's just say that this folder is 200 gigabytes worth of information. Lots and lots and lots and lots of files. Now, those files don't change very often, but it's big, and you have to back it up. If you are not using role-based management, and if suddenly Penny needs access to this folder, and you do it this way by adding Penny, sorry, I keep forgetting that dialog box is stuck. We'll use this example. And so if someone needs permission to this folder, and you add a permission to the permissions list, by adding a permissions to the permissions list, you have just flagged the archive bit on the folder and on all files within the folder that inherit that permission. And when you run backup, the entire 200 gigabytes is going to be backed up, even though nothing's changed. It's only the access control list that's changed. Every time you change a permission, you're causing everything to be backed up again, which is increasing your backup size and your backup time. And I have an insurance company in the United States that has 40,000 users, and they were finding their backups weren't finishing overnight. They switched to role-based management, and their backups started finishing in 3 hours. It was only because in the real world they were adding permissions to the permissions list that their backups weren't attainable. And they were paying more for backups than they needed to because they were paying more for tapes and media and management of those backups. So that's yet another reason for role-based management, is once you have the group with the permission, you're changing the access by adding a user to the group. That doesn't do anything to the access control list itself. It doesn't cause that file to be backed up again. All right. So let's wrap this up with a quick discussion of how to get to role-based management in your organization. So here are some thoughts about how to sell role-based management to your organization, why it's important. First, you need to make sure you understand why it's important. You have to really get role-based management. You have to be able to think about it and talk about the terms. And you have to understand that this does rely on groups and that there are some big benefits to relying on groups, but there's also a couple of things you have to be aware of to make it work. And you definitely have to get past scars of group management from the past, because anyone who's my age or older remembers group management in Windows NT4 and the early days of Windows 2000, which could be even more painful, and they'll just resist it just because they remember the pain. So once you're there, to sell role-based management to your organization, ask them the kinds of questions I just asked you. How do we say what a user can do? How do we report what users can access a resource? How do we hire a new user and ensure that user gets everything that user needs? How do we manage change in our environment? And the chances are your organization won't have answers to all of these questions because you're not using role-based management yet. So ask those same kinds of questions that I've been showing you through this event so far. Demonstrate the kinds of solutions I've given you. So for example, you can show them the membership report tool. And I'll give you those scripts. And just to whet your appetite, I'm going to show you one other script that I will give you. This is the one script you won't be able to really use, though, yet. And I'll show you why. There's a script I've got called Members Access Report. And this is what I can use when the boss says, who can edit the budget? The way this script works is I pick the budget, I pick the access level. It takes a second, and it tells me. Now, that's a great kind of tool to have, isn't it? Again, this is leveraging discipline in my naming convention. What this tool does is it builds this drop-down list dynamically by going into Active Directory and querying every group that starts with ACL. It then takes the delimiter, this underscore, and it says, okay, I have accounting, I have board meetings, I have budget, and I have company share. So it basically just dissects the groups that I have and dynamically builds the list of resources, because resources is always right after the delimiter. Once I pick a resource, it goes back to Active Directory and queries and says, tell me all the groups that start with ACL underscore budget. It sees edit and read, and it builds the drop-down list. So if your naming convention is exactly like mine, where you start with ACL underscore, the resource name underscore, and then the permission, you can actually use this tool. But if you don't use the exact same naming convention, you'll need to go in and change the business logic in the script itself. But if you start showing your boss and your security team these kinds of tools, they will get very excited about it. It definitely is a win situation. And once you've sold why it's important and the benefits, then you can start talking about what you need to do to get there. And to get there, you really need to analyze your environment. You need to be able to define roles. You need to be able to define rules. And that's not easy. That's a tough exercise. You need to define naming conventions. That's a little bit easier. You need to define processes. That's a little bit easier. And you really need to start maintaining and encouraging discipline. So when groups are created, when folders are created, the right processes are followed. And one thing to think about is that you don't have to get there overnight. What I encourage my customers to do is understand their environment, create some naming conventions, and then say, okay, starting tomorrow, whenever we create a new folder, we're going to do it right. It's going to have we're going to create the folder, we're going to create the right groups in Active Directory, we're going to assign those permissions starting tomorrow. And then over time, you go back and backfill and fix the stuff that's already in your environment. Because that is working, it's just not very manageable. So over time, you go back and backfill it. So that's what I encourage you to do there. Remember the max token size. Again, hard limit is 1,024. This slide just summarizes what we've just talked about. And the final couple of tips I'll give you to leave you with is do think about the other properties that you have in Active Directory. You've already seen that in Active Directory, when I look at a group like ACL underscore budget edit, I see a really nice description. And I see in the notes field the resources that this group has permissions to. And it might have permissions to multiple resources. So I'm very disciplined about descriptions, about using the notes field, about using the managed by field, and about preventing groups from being deleted by setting an ACL that denies delete permission so that a group doesn't get accidentally deleted. So there's lots of good stuff you can do to manage groups. There's some nice commands in the slide deck for copying memberships from one group to another. dsget lets you do that. PowerShell also does. We've talked about delegating membership. And the final thing I'll point out is a cool little script I'll give you that creates what are called shadow groups. Shadow groups are a neat opportunity in Active Directory to create dynamic groups. One of the real challenges with role-based management is just managing the groups memberships themselves. And what shadow groups do is they look at, they maintain the membership of a group based on a query. So that if you change something elsewhere in Active Directory, the group membership updates itself. So for example, I've set up a shadow group that defines who is in Antwerp. So if we look at our Antwerp group, we look who the members are, we'll see all kinds of users there. You will not see me. You do not see Dan Holme in that list. I'm going to go to my account, and I'm going to say that my office is Antwerp. Click OK. So all I've done is change the office attribute on my account. We'll give it a few minutes, and we're actually out of time here, but we'll see it happen in just a minute. Within about 1 minute, we're going to see that I am a member of this group, and we'll just give it a second, find out, and we'll wait for that. And this is called a shadow group, and all it is simply is a script that's running in the background that runs a query and updates group membership. So I'll show you the script really quick. I'll give you this script. It's documented, and all you need to do is specify the group you're trying to change and give it the LDAP query that is defining the membership of that group. So in this case, I'm looking for all users whose physical delivery office name, which is the attribute for office, is Antwerp. And if you change that section right there to match your environment with your domain name, your group name, and your query, and if you're not familiar with LDAP query syntax, you can figure it out on TechNet. It's pretty easy, actually. I have this running as a scheduled task every minute on my domain controller, on one of my domain controllers. And so if it's been a minute, we should see, not quite yet. but it'll be there very, very soon. So that updates that particular group. So hopefully that's one last little tidbit for you. I hope you enjoy that as well. Just a reminder, you'll be able to download these slides. There's information in the resource kit, including all the scripts that I'm going to give you, but you don't need the resource kit to do this stuff. I'm going to give you all the scripts. In the resource kit, though, there's about 100 pages on role-based management. So if you really need to dive into it, that's good reading. Jump up on Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn and follow us as an event. The Edge site will have the slides after this event. And in the slides is the link to my SkyDrive where I will put the scripts for you. And if you have any problems, don't hesitate to email me. I've spent a lot of time doing role-based management with customers. I'm happy to help you get there because I know it will help you down the road. So I hope this session helped you. I hope the event was great for you as well. Please travel safely, and I'll stick around to answer questions if you'd like. Otherwise, bon voyage, and thanks a lot. Dank u wel.